The year, 1812. The place, Washington, D.C. Shiza, shiza, shiza! King George III slammed his fist onto the desk of the White House. Who knew these Puritans had such big balls? His white wig shook with rage on his quivering, wrinkly head. Therin Alrik, a powerful English commander, was unaware the King of England spoke German, but he didn't let it faze him. We can pursue them to Maryland, Therin said, though secretly he was having doubts. He was beginning to think the King of England was a little bit of a prick. Too much work. Just burn down the city. Light it all on fire. Bring me a hamburger. A servant hurried out of the room. What? Therin exclaimed. What about all the innocent women and children? Therin thought it was generally a bad idea to kill innocent people. Lame, King George III said. You're fired, Therin. What I need are yes men. I'm going to go snort a line of Adderall. King George III left Therin alone in the old White House. Therin picked up a Christmas ornament left over from American Christmas 8 months ago. Ah, American Christmas. It seems so much more beautiful than English Christmas. A tear squeezed out of his right eye. Who am I? He whispered. The tear fell onto the Christmas ornament just as the first fires appeared in Washington, D.C. Little did Therin know, it was a magical Christmas ornament. The power of Therin's tears summoned a hurricane tornado to come and extinguish the fires started by the English that night. And that is why Therin Alrik is known as the hero of the War of 1812. And the generals gave him the gift of Nevada and also immortality to have dominion over Nevada for all of time. First-year nonfiction writer, Therin Alrik.
I'm genuinely impressed by that. Okay, I gave her what I assumed to be the hardest materials to work with, and that was ridiculous. Okay. This story I'm about to read is just as true as that. It's called Waiting for Odin. I got back in the afternoon when the day was hottest, back to our small ranch-style home that sat on the corner of 300 West and 50 North off Highway 32. White fiber cement siding covered the porch on the east side, and the rest was made up of yellow brick. The yard was well kept, an open lawn with a couple hackberry trees. My father used one of them to fasten a zip line from the northeast corner of the porch to the edge of the property, but I think that came later. The house was just one story, totaling 5 rooms and a bathroom. Plenty of space for a young couple with a newborn. This was the only place of my father's I would ever call home. My mother moved out when I was 3 years old, and I continued living there until she was awarded sole custody after the divorce finalized. I was 5.5 then. Part of the deal was to sell and split the house, so my father moved about 20 minutes up the highway, and I moved into my mom's apartment in town, the upper level of a residence owned by a man who would eventually become my stepfather. By the time she remarried, I was 5 3/4. But on this day, I was still only 4. It was July 2001. After my mother dropped me off, the first thing my father told me was that my cat, Odin, had died. His words were soft and sympathetic. He brought me around to the west side of the house, where the front door led to the living room, over to one of those hackberry trees where my parents had once propped me up on a branch and taken a photograph while Odin clambered along behind me, where my father had laid Odin's body after being struck by a car. I was confused by the enormous bloodied hole in the side of his torso. He looked like he was sleeping, except for the perfectly round bit of missing flesh and a collection of maggots and earthworms burrowing trenches inside him. To me, he didn't look like he'd been run over. As I looked down at Odin's black, tender fur, my father stared out at the street and with a crack in his voice said, "He missed you so much that he went out looking for you one day and got hit." We buried him at the back of the yard, where the perfectly trimmed 2 3/4-inch grass met the knee-high cornfield. I don't remember doing it, but I know he's there. It was July again, only 7 years later. My stepfather had been promoted to manage Frontier Airlines ticket desk at the Kansas City International Airport, far from where we lived in Lebanon, Indiana. There was a custody battle, which my father lost. The aftermath had been terrible. I was scheduled to be with him during the court date, and when he came back to the house, his body crumpled and he cried. It was midday, so I took a nap in the upstairs bedroom because I enjoyed the way the sunlight covered the floor up there. I lay on a mattress pad under a couple of blankets as old as I was, while my father sat in the corner, looking through photos and notes and letters, just bawling, howling almost. But on this day, things had quieted down. It was a week or so later, and my father was taking me to Indianapolis, where my grandparents lived on the corner of 46th and Pennsylvania Street. The new arrangement would be that I returned to Lebanon one weekend a month, which was only affordable because my stepfather, as Frontier's desk manager, could get me on the plane for free. My father was trying to explain to me why this was a bad idea as we were driving. I don't recall having defended it myself or suggested that it was, by contrast, a good idea, but here he was, yelling at his 11-year-old son, who wanted nothing more at the time than to throw a 482-mile-long rope around Kansas City and pull it right up alongside Indianapolis so everyone could get what they wanted. Imagine if someone came up to you and gave you a cat, he said, and they told you it would be your cat, except you only get to see it and play with it one day a month. How would you feel about a situation like that? And I replied that I wouldn't accept it because I wouldn't trust the person giving me the cat. His face started to contort the way it does when things aren't going his way. I continued saying that it would be too weird because no one randomly gives you a cat without wanting something from you. Everyone always seems to want something from you. And he yelled back, "No, why do you always have to make everything so difficult? You would get attached. You wouldn't take it because you would get attached to the cat and you would miss it if you only saw it once a month." And I felt stupid. I got angry at myself for never seeing the obvious and always overthinking everything. I'm not supposed to be that way. Everyone around me was always telling me how gifted I was, how smart I was, but I hadn't understood my father's analogy, and I still hadn't come up with a way to make this all go away, to make everyone stop crying and shouting at me. We sat in silence until we arrived at my grandparents'. For the rest of the trip, I thought about Odin. I thought about how much I would love to see him again, if only once a month, if only for a single day, and that was it. Starting with Labor Day, I flew back to Indianapolis every month for the first year. Eventually, the visits became less frequent. Excuses started to be made. Chief among them, my stepfather lost his position at Frontier Airlines after 3 months on the job. That had to be kept secret from my father. But I returned as often as I could anyway, each time imagining, without reason and for only a moment, my father not being there to pick me up, that someone else would be there, my father's father, perhaps, to bring me around to the west side of that house on the corner of 300 West and 50 North off Highway 32, to that hackberry tree where Odin and I had once climbed together, where they'd laid my father's body after he wandered out into the street to look for me and was struck by a car. And when I looked down, I would notice the hole in my father's side. It would be my size. I would tuck myself in it, and they would bury us together in the back of the yard, where the still perfectly trimmed 2 3/4-inch grass met the knee-high cornfield. These days, about twice a year, I return to a place in my mind, a place like a permanent exhibition and a museum that's been there since July 2001. In the center of the exhibition is my 25-square-foot sandbox, where I'm sitting cross-legged, staring at the corn stalks, waiting for Odin to wander out of them and back onto our property, trampling over his unmarked grave as though it were nothing. Behind me, between the sandbox and the yellow brick house, is everyone else who needs to be here. My mother and her third husband, my father, my stepfather, my grandparents who still live at the corner of 46th and Pennsylvania Street, the person who gave my stepfather his promotion, the judge who presided over the custody battle. A woman named Dorothy Cripes, who hired my father to do housework for her when he was in high school, who hanged herself in her kitchen one day for my father to find and gave him the inheritance to her entire estate, which he would sell and use the money to buy the house she's standing behind. Dorothy Cripes' neighbor, who gave Odin to my parents when my mother was pregnant as a maternity gift. Everyone whose lives resulted in our gathering here today, everyone who wanted something from me, everyone who would be affected by what I hope Odin will say when he emerges from the knee-high cornfield. I'm waiting for him to stroll up to me, trifling through the sandbox, to press his torso against my knee and arch his back so I'll rub my hand down his spine, to whip his tail around and do it again. I'm waiting for him to tell me he wasn't looking for me at all, that he saw a mouse scurry across the road and went out to chase it, that he'd simply gotten bored and wanted to go on an adventure, or that he wanted to lie down in the road because he liked the way the sunlight covered the pavement. I'm waiting for him to tell me it wasn't my fault, to tell everyone that nothing I could have done would have changed any of it, to make them stop crying and shouting. I return to this place when my parents remind me how not alike we've become. When my father talks of buying 40 pounds of pumpkins at the grocery store because they were on sale, and now he's been eating nothing but pumpkin squash for 6 weeks. When my mother marries a man from Portland she only knew on Facebook for 6 months and had never met in person. When they separate, then get back together all in the span of a year, and somewhere in the middle of this sends me a message explaining how she thinks she can rap because she smokes pot even though she's a 42-year-old white woman. About twice a year, I break down and collapse onto my bed, bawling, howling almost, because I've left them all, and we seem to be lost from one another forever, and I already know what will happen if I go out looking for them.